Since we're now into the free agent interview period in the NHL, I thought today we should discuss who are the top 20 free agents that are currently on the market looking for a new home and a new contract. We'll discuss all those players coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams. So if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, we're now into the NHL free agent interview period where anybody who is a pending UFA can speak with other teams, gauge interest, and kind of start making decisions on where they may go. Obviously, July the 1st is free agent frenzy when a lot of these contracts are going to actually be made official and be signed. But a lot of these players right now are kind of going through the feeling out process and interviewing with other teams who may be interested. So even though there's not a ton of big names, there is a long list here of fairly decent quality players who could be making a move and changing uniforms this coming fall. So I'm going to tell you who I think are the top 20 available players that are pending UFAs right now. These players are not necessarily ranked in any particular order. Obviously, we saw one big name come off the list here over the weekend with John Carlson staying with the Washington Capitals. Carlson signing an 8-year extension worth $8 million per year for a $64 million contract. So obviously that was huge for the Capitals. After trading in Grubauer and Orpik, they made room to be able to retain Carlson. As we've been talking about here, I've mentioned a few times, I thought it was going to be really tricky and challenging for them to do that, but it moved out enough money to be able to get it done and retain their top defenseman. So that's great news for Capitals fans for sure. So you can scratch Carlson off the free agent list. Obviously, the biggest name out there is John Tavares. It's been reported that John Tavares is going to be meeting with approximately 5 teams plus the Islanders here over the next few days to kind of decide what he wants to do. We did a dedicated video yesterday to Tavares, which you may or may not have watched, but just to clarify, at that point in time, it was being reported that the 5 teams outside of the Islanders that were going to be talking to Tavares was the Sharks, the Blues, the Leafs, the Golden Knights, and the Stars. But since then, I've seen some more clarifying reports indicating it looks as though that the St. Louis Blues are not in the mix, and it doesn't look like Vegas may not be in the mix either. They may be trying to get in there, but a couple teams that are apparently in the mix that wasn't being reported at the time of that video was the Boston Bruins and the Tampa Bay Lightning. So that shouldn't come as any surprise. Steve Yzerman seems to always have his nose in over the big name players. So even though Tampa's a powerhouse now, it looks like they might be trying to figure out if they can add Tavares as well. So obviously there's a lot of Atlantic Division teams and a few Western teams kind of in the mix here, along with the Islanders trying to retain JT's services. If you haven't seen that video, you can get a dedicated analysis on his situation. There's a link down below in the description. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Tavares here today. Obviously, he's the biggest name out there on the market. We can certainly rank him #1 for sure. But since we did a dedicated video yesterday, we'll leave him here ranked as #1 and move along to these other guys. You can watch yesterday's video to get more of an analysis on the Tavares situation. Now, first of all, let's jump into some of the free agent goalies. Now, unfortunately for teams looking for goaltending this year, there is a lot of guys that have experience as starters, but they're kind of coming to the twilight of their career here. The goaltending market isn't overly deep this year for free agents. I mean, some of these guys were starting goaltenders, but they're kind of on the back end of their careers and not really starters anymore. And a lot of these guys have been pretty decent backup goalies, so it kind of depends on what teams are looking for. But here's some of the top names. In my opinion, the top free agent goaltender available right now is Carter Hutton of the St. Louis Blues. He's coming off a fantastic season where he played a little bit more than usual, put up some great numbers. At times, certainly outplayed Jake Allen as the starting goaltender for stretches of the year. So St. Louis probably can't really afford to lose this guy. But so far during the interviewing period, it looks as though Hutton has been received interest from at least 8 to 10 teams is what I was reading. So there's a heavy interest in Carter Hutton. Now, some teams might be interested in making him their starting goaltender, and other teams might be looking to do an upgrade on the back for the backup role. Either way, depends on kind of what Carter Hutton's looking here for. I mean, if he really wants a chance to play more and be a starter, then we very well may see him leave St. Louis. But considering how much interest there is, I think the Blues are going to have a hard time retaining him. At this point in his career, he's 32 years old. He's been a career backup, but coming off probably, you could argue, his career year. So obviously at this point in time, looks as though Carter Hutton's in high demand. Certainly one of the best goalies on the free agent market. And due to the market kind of being a little thin in this position, I think the Blues are going to have a hard time retaining him. but there's certainly a few teams coming to mind, like the Islanders, the Hurricanes, for example. Those are certainly some teams that I would certainly think would gauge interest with Carter Hutton. Elsewhere on the goalie market, we've got goaltender Cam Ward, who's got tons of experience with the Hurricanes. Looks as though he's likely not returning to Carolina, so he's looking for a new home. You've also got Dallas Stars goaltender Kari Lehtonen. Lehtonen, I think his time might be up in Dallas as well, or he's going to have to be willing to sign for significantly less money. But personally, I think he's at the end of the road with the Dallas Stars, and they likely move on, but you never know. Depending on what else they find and other deals they work on here, they may consider bringing him back on a much cheaper contract. One goalie that we didn't know for sure would be UFA going into this offseason was Robin Lehner of the Buffalo Sabres. He was supposed to be an RFA, but the Sabres have chosen not to make him a qualifying offer and to move on from him, so that now makes him a UFA. So obviously Robin Lehner, you could probably argue with Carter Hutton, is probably the two best goalies available here in the free agent market. Now Robin Lehner has been a little bit inconsistent in his career, kind of up and down, but of all these guys that are available, he's young enough that you could still work with him, that probably has the best chance of being a starter if that's what you're looking for. For the most part, of all these guys, you could certainly argue he just might be the best one. So any teams looking for goaltending out there, there is a younger goaltender who still has the potential to be a starter, and Robin Lehner available. Bruins backup Anton Khudobin's on this list as well. He had a great year for the Bruins. He's certainly pretty solid in a backup role. I'm not sure I would want him to be a starting goaltender. He's up into his 30s as well, but he's certainly a solid backup. I would think the Bruins would likely want to retain him, especially where they lost Malcolm Subban as a waiver claim last year. They don't have Subban to fall back on anymore. So I would think Khudobin likely gets retained by the Bruins, but at this point in time, he is a free agent and entertaining offers. And with the teams that are looking for goalies, I'm sure they're inquiring on a lot of these guys. So keep your eyes on the Bruins, but I would think, though, that they do stand a good chance at retaining him. Then I'm going to mention here is Jonathan Bernier of the Colorado Avalanche. It looks as though his time is up with the Avs starting goaltender Semyon Varlamov under contract still. They've already signed goaltender from the Czech Republic, Pavel Francouz, to a one-year deal. And then at the NHL draft, we saw them trade for Philip Grubauer. So they certainly don't need Bernier as well. I thought they might give Francouz a shot at being a backup this year to see if he could possibly take over as a starting goaltender, maybe in a year or so to take over for Varlamov. But it looks as though they might be going that route with Philip Grubauer, or we could see a tandem of Grubauer and Francouz here in the near future as well. I think the Avalanche might end up making another move within the goalie market. You never know here. I mean, they do have 3 guys under contract now, so it is possible that we could see that. Otherwise, they could have Francouz play in the American Hockey League to get a little bit more seasoning there before bringing him up to the NHL level. Now, amongst the skaters that are available as free agents, now some of these guys have been linked to certain teams, some of them have not. For example, we got Thomas Plekanec is heavily rumored he may go back to Montreal. Obviously, he's just a little bit shy playing his 1,000th NHL career game. I think he'd love to do that in a Habs uniform. They did seem open to bringing him back, but there hasn't been much chatter on that recently, so we'll see what happens with Thomas Plekanec. They definitely won't be going back to Toronto. I think that's pretty much a guarantee, and I think his preferred destination would be go back to Montreal, but we'll see if they have interest to do that. I know when he was first traded, it was discussed they likely would, but things change all the time here, so we'll see how the Habs feel about that now that we're actually into free agency. Another guy to keep your eye on, too, is Ryan Reeves. I mean, he's bounced around a little bit now. He went from St. Louis to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Vegas, and it looks as though Vegas is having a hard time coming to terms with some of their free agents. Now, outside of Ryan Reeves, there's a few more guys on this list here. We might as well do them all at the same time. We got Ryan Reeves, David Perron, and the real deal, James Neal. All 3 of these guys are UFAs, and they're having a difficult time coming to terms with the Vegas Golden Knights. It was kind of assumed by a lot of people earlier this season with all the success they've had that it shouldn't be too difficult to retain these guys, but at the same time, they're at the points in their career where they're looking for some term and some security, and after the season they had, I think they'd like to get paid as well. Not that Vegas has any shortage of cap space. They have all kinds of that. There is no problems there whatsoever. However, George McPhee is certainly the type of general manager. In this case with the Vegas Golden Knights, they're trying to spend wisely here. I think they're really interested in trying to bring in a bigger name either through trade or free agent, whether it be trading for a top defenseman or trying to sign like a John Tavares or something along those lines. Obviously, in the free agent market, though, if they don't get Tavares, there's not really many other names that come close to equaling what he could deliver to a team. At the same time, though, they are having a difficult time coming to terms with all 3 of these players. So it is possible that none of these guys might return to Vegas. At the same time, though, we're in our spot with free agency where they're going through an interview period and trying to see what else is out there. They very well may circle back to Vegas and come back and maybe accept a different offer than they've already been looking at. But I know with Ryan Reeves, it wasn't so much on dollars, it was term. He wanted a little bit more longer term security, and it was having a hard time agreeing on that. With Nhl and Perron, it was speculated that James Neal was looking between $6.5 to $7 million. And to be honest, if that's what he wants, I wouldn't pay him if I were Vegas either. I mean, he is a solid player, he can score some goals, but I don't think he's a $7 million player. I think he's more in line, maybe between 5 and 6. But it certainly wouldn't be going 6.5, 7. At least that's my opinion. I'm not sure what David Perron was looking for, but he's changed teams a lot too over the years, and I think he was looking for a little bit more term than maybe Vegas was willing to offer. I think that's what the sticking point was with him, more so than money, or could have been a combination of both. There hasn't really been a lot reported on the what's caused the negotiations to not go well, except all that's been said is that they weren't going well. So I guess time will tell. But all three of those guys are fairly decent names. Obviously with Ryan Reeves, doesn't play as big of a role. But as we've seen in the playoffs with Vegas and before with Pittsburgh and even in St. Louis, like, he can be an effective player and certainly play a decent bottom 6 role. So even though he's not a huge name, I thought I would include him on this list just because he did show in this year's playoffs with Vegas that he can be a little bit more important than sometimes he gets credit for. Another guy to keep your eye on is speedster Michael Grabner. Obviously, Michael Grabner's changed teams enough times throughout his career as well. Had the most success during his time with the New York Rangers, was traded to the New Jersey Devils at the deadline. I don't see him going back to the Devils. That didn't really work out overly well with his time in New Jersey. So it has been speculated that the Rangers are interested in bringing him back. Now, we'll see if that actually comes to be or not, because it does look as though they're quite interested in sticking with their plan and going with younger, faster, skilled players. Now, obviously, he does provide the speed. I mean, he's a great penalty killer, and he can certainly score a fair bit of goals, especially shorthanded. So he very well might fit with their kind of rebuilding plans more than a lot of other veteran players. So it wouldn't completely shock me if he went back to New York. Another veteran player who's looking for work is Chris Kunitz. It looks as though Tampa Bay won't be bringing him back after leaving Pittsburgh and signing a 1-year deal with Tampa. It looks as though he's interested in continuing to play, and he's not going to be able to get that opportunity with the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, I have seen some speculation maybe the Penguins would bring him back. Obviously, it would have to be a 1-year deal, likely low-value contract, no more than $1 million. But even that's no guarantee that the Penguins could really squeeze that into their lineup right now. But it looks as though they do have some other things they might be working on the trade front, so we'll have to see what happens with Pittsburgh. He wants to keep playing, trying to chase one more Stanley Cup before he hangs him up. So I do expect if he does get signed, it's going to be with a team who has an excellent shot at contending. Pittsburgh was a name that was brought up, but no guarantees for sure. But that was the only link I seen, is him possibly going back there. But I guess time will tell here once we get a little more clarity on who's interested. Another player to watch is defenseman Jack Johnson. As we all know, near the trade deadline, he did ask for the Columbus Blue Jackets to move him along and to trade him. Unfortunately, they were not able to facilitate a trade. Now he can handle that on his own as a pending UFA here. So obviously he's going to be leaving Columbus. We know that much for sure. The main team that's been linked to him so far is the Montreal Canadiens. Now, it's been reported that he's looking for some term and he's looking for some decent money. And unfortunately, it looks as though Montreal might be willing to give it to him. To be completely honest, I'm not sure why they would want to do this. The last thing they need is another aging defenseman on a bad contract with too much money. I mean, they have enough of that already. Not to say that they couldn't use some help on defense. They certainly could. But there's it's just not the way to go, I don't think. So if you're a Habs fan, let me know. If they go and sign Jack Johnson to 3, 4, 5-year deal, $4 or $5 million, like, is this something that you would be happy with as a Montreal fan or not? But that's what's being reported. Obviously, we have the big names with the Maple Leafs that are free agents. We have James Van Riemsdyk, Tyler Bozak, and Leo Komarov. I do think there's a decent chance Bozak or Komarov, not both, I don't think could possibly remain with Toronto. I know that Bozak was apparently getting a lot of interest. I know JVR's had a ton of interest. I'm sure with the way Leo Komarov's played in Toronto, it wouldn't be shocking to see him return. But at the same time, I don't think they'd bring back him and Tyler Bozak. But I know they were it was reported that the Leafs were interested in possibly bringing back one or both for the right amount of money. But considering everything they're working on and going after John Tavares, Bozak has expressed interest to be able to remain with the Leafs. He loves being in Toronto. He's been there a long time. I know with James Van Riemsdyk, obviously he had a career year. He can be a solid 30 goal scorer. A lot of his goals come in tight, big power play specialist. So obviously there's a lot of teams he could help. I've seen reports that he's had at least interest from 8 to 10 teams as well. So I personally don't think JVR returns to Toronto. I'm doubtful that Bozak or Komarov could return to Toronto as well. But it is remotely possible if one of them is willing to accept a short-term deal with, on a low-valued contract. But time will tell. But I think all three of these guys can add value to other teams, especially JVR, who's still young enough and to provide a 30-goal scoring winger. Certainly, there's not too many of those here on this list. So So I think JVR will be in high demand. Another name to watch too is defenseman Calvin Nhl of the New York Islanders. I mean, he's not a big flashy defenseman, but he is a solid second pairing guy who can play some solid D and put up a few points. I think the odds are slim that he returns to the island. Myself, he spent a big chunk of last year being injured, but he's had a ton of interest here since the interview period has begun. I've seen reports that he's getting lots of interest. I think 8 or 10 teams inquiring on him as well. There's lots of teams looking for defense. So I think Calvin Nhl can be one of the better valued contracts handed out here this offseason. I think he could probably be had for a less money due to the fact that he was injured so much last year and kind of needs to reprove himself again. Probably going to get a shorter term deal as well. So there's going to be lots of action on Calvin Nhl. It'll be interesting to see where he goes. Obviously, there's defenseman Mike Green with the Detroit Red Wings. Obviously, not really clear if they're interested in bringing him back or not. At the same time, with the rebuild they're going through, it may not really make sense to have a player his age for what he'd want to get paid on the roster. There hasn't been as much talk about Mike Green this offseason as there was at the trade deadline. So at this point in time, it's not really clear where he may end up. But obviously, being one of the more offensively gifted defensemen on the open market here, he's bound to get some interest. With where he's at with his career and his age, I'm sure he's going to want a little bit more security than some teams may be willing to offer. So that's certainly going to boil things down to where he may end up as well. We've got Rick Nash, who obviously played a long time with the Columbus Blue Jackets, New York Rangers, and then was traded to the Boston Bruins at the deadline. I don't see him returning to Boston myself. Now, if Boston missed out on Ilya Kovalchuk, they're rumored to be in on John Tavares, but if that doesn't happen, could they circle back to Rick Nash? Maybe, but personally, I just don't see it happening. So far, it's been reported that the team that Nash is most interested in would be to go back to the Columbus Blue Jackets where he started his career. It doesn't look as though there's much interest from the Rangers to bring him back, at least at this point in time, but depending on how other plans work out, that could change. But I think the real possibility of Rick Nash going back to maybe end his career with the Columbus Blue Jackets might be a real possibility here. They certainly would like to add a scoring winger. He would like to come back. By the sounds of it, he's very interested in going back to Columbus. Would work well for his family as well. So certainly a possible to see a reunion here between the Columbus Blue Jackets and Rick Nash. Obviously, Paul Stastny was a big acquisition by the Winnipeg Jets at the trade deadline and fit in tremendously well on that second line, playing with Nick Ehlers and Patrick Laine. They would love to be able to retain Paul Stastny, but it's going to be incredibly difficult with their cap situation. They have a lot of young players that are due raises or recently gotten the bigger contracts, and they're kind of in a bit of a cap crunch here. So it's going to be really difficult. If we happen to see any deals coming out of Winnipeg with any players being traded out, then that's probably going to be a good indication that they're working on retaining Paul Stastny. But to be honest, I wouldn't trade out much youth. As much as Stastny fit well on that second line, I wouldn't trade a younger player to retain a 32-year-old center who's probably only going to have a couple more good years before things really start to fall off here. So personally, if I were Winnipeg, I'd like to be able to keep him on a shorter-term deal, but I'm not going to sacrifice my future and my youth of this team to be able to retain him. It has been reported as well that he is getting interest to either go back to St. Louis, possibly to go back to Colorado as well, where he started. So there is a fair bit of interest in Paul Stastny after the playoffs he had. It's certainly going to drive up his value in the term that he can demand on a new contract. And I'm not so sure that the Winnipeg Jets are going to be able to commit to that without sacrificing much of their future, which just doesn't seem to make sense for them. So we'll see what happens with Paul Stastny. The last player we're going to get into here is Jumbo Joe Thornton of San Jose Sharks. Obviously, he's had back-to-back seasons of significant injuries, but he's one of the greatest players to have played the game. He's had a tremendous career, arguably the greatest player in the NHL who has not lifted the Stanley Cup as of yet. Obviously, the San Jose Sharks are trying to be aggressive and do a lot of great things here. They've already brought in Evander Kane at last year's trade deadline. They've re-signed him. They were in on a Mike Hoffman trade and then flipped him to Florida for a bunch of picks. They've got tons of cap space. It's been speculated here, as we mentioned, that they're trying to get John Tavares as well. So even if they land John Tavares, personally, I think there's a pretty good chance Joe Thornton remains with the San Jose Sharks. Even if he has to take a one-year deal at, say, $3, $4, $5 million, which is a fair bit less than he made before, I think he would do that if he really thinks he has a chance to stay in San Jose and win a Stanley Cup. I think he would really want to do that before he retires. So personally, is it possible Joe Thornton goes to another team? It is, but I don't think the odds are very good. Personally, I think they'll find a way to keep Thornton on the payroll while looking to add other pieces to make them have a really excellent shot to be a cup contender for this coming season. So I think all in all here, we ended up talking about more than 20 free agents, so you get more than the top 20 here today. If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there is plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.